What would you do if the last face you saw in a courtroom wasn't the accused, but the one collapsing to the floor? The room didn't gasp at first. It froze. A daughter, standing alone, watching a judge clear his throat, adjust his glasses, and read words that would end a dynasty forever. Life. No parole. No appeal in sight. And before the sentence could even fully land, her knees buckled. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not just a courtroom story. It's not even just a crime story. It's a story about power, about image, about what happens when a family built on admiration, applause, and control finally cracks in public. Because the most disturbing part isn't what happened inside the house that night. It's how long everyone pretended nothing was wrong. Ask yourself this. How many secrets can a famous family hide before one of them explodes? Hollywood has always sold us a fantasy. Perfect homes behind gates, smiling interviews, award speeches filled with gratitude and grace. But behind those gates, behind the hedges, behind the curated photographs, there are pressures most people never see. And in this fictional docudrama, those pressures collide in the worst possible way. Early Sunday morning, an affluent neighborhood. The kind of street where joggers wave, where security cameras blink silently, where nothing ever seems to go wrong. Until it does. By Sunday afternoon, two bodies are discovered. A legendary filmmaker. His wife, a respected creative force in her own right. The media moves fast. Too fast. Headlines write themselves before facts are known. Speculation spreads faster than confirmation. And one name keeps resurfacing. The son. The one no one talks about in interviews. The one who drifted away from the spotlight. The one family friends describe with careful pauses. But there's another figure in this story. One the cameras didn't expect. The daughter. The golden child. The one who stayed close. The one who defended the family name publicly and privately. The one who would later be accused of helping after the fact. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because how do you reconcile love with loyalty? When loyalty might mean crossing a line you can never uncross. In the days following the discovery, neighbors reported strange details. A light on at an odd hour. A car leaving earlier than usual. A door that didn't look forced, but wasn't locked either. Small things. The kind people dismiss. At first, police kept their statements vague. Investigators spoke carefully. But behind closed doors, they were already building a timeline. And timelines don't care about reputations. As the story leaks, public opinion fractures. Some say the family was targeted. Others whisper about long-standing tensions, money disputes, emotional fractures that never healed. And then the rumors begin. A heated argument. A history of resentment. A night that spiraled out of control. But here's the part most people miss. Crimes like this don't begin with knives. They begin years earlier. In silence. In favoritism. In wounds that never get addressed because admitting them would shatter the image everyone profits from. The trial becomes a spectacle. Every seat filled. Every sketch artist racing to capture expressions. Every reporter hoping to be the one who notices the detail everyone else misses. And in the center of it all, the daughter sits quietly. Too quietly, some say. She doesn't cry when the photos are shown. She doesn't look away when testimony turns graphic. She listens. Is that strength? Shock? Or something else entirely? Prosecutors paint a picture of coordination, of decisions made after the fact, of loyalty overriding morality. The defense pushes back hard. They talk about trauma, about fear, about a sister trying to protect what little family she had left. And the audience is left with an impossible question. At what point does helping someone you love become helping them destroy everything? Week by week, contradictions emerge. A phone call that doesn't match a statement. A timestamp that doesn't line up with a memory. A text message that was never meant to be read aloud. And then comes the final day. The courtroom is packed tighter than ever. No one breathes normally. The judge speaks slowly, deliberately. Words carry weight here. And when the sentence is read, it isn't just the convicted who feel it. It hits the daughter like a physical blow. Witnesses later describe the moment as surreal. Her face drains of color. Her hands shake. She tries to stand. She doesn't make it. The collapse becomes the image everyone remembers. Shared, looped, analyzed. But here's what no headline can answer. Was that collapse grief or guilt? And more importantly, What happened in the hours after the crime that never made it into the headlines? Because buried in the testimony, overlooked by the cameras, is a detail that changes how everything looks. A detail that suggests the story didn't end when the house went quiet that night. It only began. Before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the police tape and the flashing lights. Ask yourself this. How many families look perfect right up until the moment they don't? Because the truth is, collapses like this don't come out of nowhere. They arrive quietly. They grow slowly. They disguise themselves as tradition, loyalty, and love. And this story begins the way so many Hollywood myths do, with applause. Decades earlier, the family at the center of this fictional docudrama wasn't known for controversy. They were known for success. Awards on shelves. Invitations stacked on marble counters. A last name that opened doors without knocking. The father was a storyteller by trade. A man celebrated for understanding human emotion on screen, praised for empathy, timing, warmth. Audiences trusted him. Critics admired him. Industry peers sought his approval. The mother was quieter, but no less influential. Behind the scenes, she shaped projects, managed creative chaos, and protected the family's image with near-military precision. Friends described her as elegant, controlled, unshakable. Together, they were seen as a unit. Balanced, stable, unbreakable. But here's the first contradiction. Families that appear most stable are often the ones holding the most pressure inside. From the outside, the children looked lucky, privileged, blessed. From the inside, the expectations were suffocating. The daughter arrived first. The golden child. The one who learned early how to read a room, how to keep peace, how to anticipate emotional weather before storms arrived. She was praised for being mature, responsible, reliable. Those labels stick, and they shape people. The son came later. Different temperament. Quieter, more sensitive, less interested in applause and more affected by it. While others saw opportunity, he felt comparison. Every family dinner became a performance review he never asked for. And slowly, invisibly, a hierarchy formed. No one announced it. No one meant to create it. But it was there. The daughter became the protector, the mediator, the one called when things went wrong, the one praised for holding things together. The son became the question mark, the worry, the topic discussed in lowered voices. And here's something few people want to admit. When one child is praised for holding the family together, another often carries the blame for pulling it apart. By the time both children reached adulthood, the family story was already written. The daughter stayed close, helped manage schedules, supported projects, smoothed tensions. She became indispensable. The son drifted, tried different paths, struggled to find footing under the shadow of a towering last name. When he failed, the failures felt public, even when they weren't. Private arguments became routine. Money conversations turned sharp. Control disguised itself as concern. Boundaries blurred. And yet, every holiday photo showed smiles. Every interview painted harmony. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Hollywood doesn't just reward success. It punishes vulnerability. So the family learned to hide fractures well. But fractures grow. Years before the crime, there was an incident most people forgot. At the time, it barely registered. A heated argument overheard by a neighbor. A door slammed hard enough to rattle frames. A raised voice that sounded less like anger and more like desperation. Police were never called. No report filed. Just another family moment. Except family moments leave echoes. The daughter stepped in, as she always did. Smoothed things over. Made excuses. Redirected attention. She told friends everything was fine. She told herself the same. And the parents, they let her. Because when someone volunteers to carry the emotional weight, it's easy to let them. Years passed. The son's distance grew. Not geographical at first, but emotional. Phone calls became sporadic. Visits shorter. Conversations careful. Resentment doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. And whispers get ignored. The parents believed control equaled safety. That if they managed tightly enough, nothing could spin out of control. They were wrong. The daughter, meanwhile, became more embedded in the family machine. She handled logistics. She fielded calls. She absorbed tension like a sponge. But even sponges saturate. Friends noticed changes. She slept less, spoke faster, smiled without warmth. When asked if she was okay, she always answered the same way. just tired. Isn't that what everyone says before something breaks? Now fast forward to the months leading up to that Sunday morning. The family was under strain. Financial disagreements surfaced. Not desperation level, but control level. Who paid for what? Who owed whom? Who had access to accounts? Control again, disguised as concern. The son wanted independence. The parents wanted oversight. The daughter stood in the middle, translating both sides while slowly disappearing herself. And here's where things take a darker turn. Text messages later revealed something chilling. Not threats, not plans, something worse. Resignation. Messages from the son that sounded final. Messages from the daughter that sounded desperate to keep peace at any cost. And messages from the parents that sounded tired. This wasn't explosive conflict. It was erosion. The night before the incident, there was a family dinner. On the surface, it went fine. Too fine. No shouting. No walkouts. Just polite conversation stretched thin over old wounds. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but avoidance. Witnesses would later say nothing seemed wrong. That's the most dangerous phrase in this entire story. Because when nothing seems wrong, no one intervenes. Sometime after midnight, everything changed. What exactly happened inside the house remains the subject of trial testimony, forensic reconstruction, and endless debate. But here's what we know in this fictional account. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle that spilled outside. Whatever happened, happened between people who knew each other, trusted each other, loved each other, in whatever broken way they could. By dawn, the house was silent. And by afternoon, the truth could no longer be hidden. When investigators arrived, they weren't just stepping into a crime scene. They were stepping into years of unspoken history. And as the investigation unfolded, one question kept resurfacing. Not who committed the act, but who helped after. Because when love turns into protection, and protection turns into concealment, lines blur fast. The daughter's role would become the most controversial aspect of the case. Did she act out of fear? Out of loyalty? Out of habit? Or did she finally cross a line she'd been inching toward for years? The trial would eventually try to answer those questions. But before a single witness took the stand, before a single charge was read, there was a moment, a quiet moment, when the daughter allegedly made a decision that could not be undone. And that decision didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the hours no one was watching. What if the most important part of this case didn't happen during the crime, but after it? Because investigators quickly realized something unsettling. The timeline didn't just have gaps. It had fingerprints. Not literal ones, behavioral ones. And those are harder to explain away. When detectives began reconstructing the hours between the final family dinner and the moment the bodies were discovered, they expected confusion, shock, disarray. What they didn't expect was order. Too much order. The house wasn't pristine, but it wasn't chaotic either. Furniture was where it belonged. Drawers weren't ripped open. Nothing screamed panic. That alone raised eyebrows. Crimes born of sudden rage usually leave mess. This one left questions. The official call for help didn't come until late Sunday morning. Not immediately. Not even at dawn. Hours had passed. What if one ordinary neighbor held the key to everything? Because the truth is, most cases don't unravel because of grand revelations. They crack because of small, human moments. A glance, a memory, a detail someone almost dismissed. And this one came from a man who never wanted to be part of the story at all. He lived 2 houses down, kept to himself. The kind of neighbor who waved politely, trimmed his hedges, and never asked questions. Until that Sunday morning. He woke earlier than usual. Couldn't sleep. Said something felt off, though he couldn't explain why. He stepped outside just after sunrise, coffee in hand, scanning the quiet street the way people do when the world feels too still. That's when he saw movement. A car in the driveway. Not unusual, except for the timing. The neighborhood was known for routine. Cars came and went at predictable hours. Early joggers. Late-night returns. Patterns. This didn't fit one. The neighbor would later describe the figure as hesitant. Not rushed. Not calm either. Controlled. Someone moving carefully, deliberately, as if aware of being seen, but assuming they weren't. He watched as the trunk opened. He watched as something was placed inside. Not large. Not heavy. Wrapped. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Maybe luggage. Maybe equipment. Maybe trash. People throw out strange things. But when the news broke hours later, The image returned with a force he couldn't ignore. The driveway, the trunk, the wrapped object. And suddenly, it mattered. When detectives finally spoke to him days later, he hesitated. He didn't want to accuse anyone, didn't want attention, didn't want to be wrong. But he told them what he saw. That testimony became the quiet hinge of the case, because it directly contradicted the daughter's version of events. She had said she left early to clear her head. She had said she didn't take anything with her. She had said she returned home before realizing something was wrong. But the neighbor's account suggested intent, not premeditation, but response. And response can still be criminal. Investigators asked a simple question. What could fit in that bundle? The answer wasn't obvious at first, until forensic analysis came back incomplete. One item associated with the crime was missing. Not a weapon exactly. Not something dramatic. Something personal. Something that tied the act to familiarity. The prosecution didn't say it out loud at first. They let the implication breathe. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. And the courtroom leaned in. Because now the daughter wasn't just emotionally involved. She was physically connected to a missing piece of evidence. When confronted with the neighbor's testimony, her composure fractured for the first time. Her voice shook. Her breathing shortened. She denied everything. She said the neighbor was mistaken. Said memory is unreliable. Said grief distorts perception. All true statements. But they didn't erase doubt. The prosecution reframed their narrative. They weren't accusing her of violence. They were accusing her of cleanup, of protecting the family image, of buying time, of acting on instinct learned over decades. They showed old interviews, old behind-the-scenes footage, moments where she stepped in seamlessly, smoothing chaos without anyone noticing. She's always been the one who handles things, a former colleague testified. Handles things. That phrase echoed again. But the defense countered with a different image. A daughter trapped by expectation. A woman conditioned to prioritize others over herself. Someone who reacted out of shock, not strategy. They brought in experts, trauma specialists, family systems psychologists. They explained how crisis responders don't always behave logically, how survival instincts override legal reasoning. How many people here, one expert asked the jury, would know exactly what to do if they discovered something like this? No one raised a hand, because that's the uncomfortable truth. No one knows how they'll behave in chaos. And yet, behavior still has consequences. The most haunting moment came when surveillance footage from a nearby street was introduced. Grainy, partially obstructed, but clear enough. A car matching the family vehicle. A timestamp aligning with the neighbor's account. The figure was indistinct, but the movement was unmistakable. Something was placed into the trunk. The defense argued it could be anything. The prosecution argued it didn't need to be everything. It only needed to be something that wasn't supposed to leave that house. And then came the cross-examination. The daughter was asked why she didn't call authorities immediately. She said she was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of losing everyone. The prosecutor asked a follow-up. Afraid of losing whom? Her answer came too quickly. My brother. That answer split the room. Because it confirmed motive. Not malicious motive. Human motive. Love. Fear. Habit. The jury now had to wrestle with something far more complicated than guilt or innocence. They had to decide whether loyalty could excuse obstruction, whether instinct could outweigh responsibility, whether a lifetime of being the fixer justified one final act of control. As the trial dragged on, public opinion fractured. Some saw her as a tragic figure. Others saw her as complicit. Social media turned ruthless. Clips of her collapse replayed endlessly. Comment sections filled with armchair judgments. She knew. She was trapped. She chose wrong. But none of those people sat in that house that night. None of them felt the weight of that phone ringing at 3 a.m. None of them had spent decades believing it was their job to make things okay. And yet, the law doesn't weigh belief. It weighs action. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to the neighbor, not as a villain, not as a hero, just as a witness. An ordinary man who saw something he almost ignored. Because ignoring things is how this story began. The defense made their final plea. They didn't deny mistakes. They denied intent. They asked the jury to see her not as an accessory, but as a casualty. Someone crushed between loyalty and legality. Someone who made the worst decision of her life in the worst moment of her life. The judge instructed the jury carefully. Emotion cannot override evidence. Sympathy cannot rewrite law. And when deliberations began, no one expected a quick verdict. Because this case wasn't simple. It was layered, human, uncomfortable. Not hidden, not burned, just handled. Laundry detergent was found on the daughter's hands. A small trace, easily dismissed. Unless you consider timing. Who does laundry after discovering tragedy? Unless they already knew. Unless they were already trying to manage consequences. The daughter broke down during that testimony. Not theatrically, quietly. Her shoulders caved inward. Her eyes dropped. Her hands twisted together as if trying to wring out an answer that wouldn't come. The defense framed it as grief. The prosecution framed it as pressure. Pressure from years of being the fixer. Because fixers don't stop fixing when things get ugly. They fix harder. Friends testified about her personality, her need for control, her inability to let situations spiral without intervention. She always handled things, one friend said. She hated messes, said another. Those statements sounded harmless. Until they weren't. A forensic analyst testified that the scene showed signs of post-event activity. Not cleanup exactly, but rearrangement. As if someone wanted the house to look normal. Normal enough to delay questions. Normal enough to buy time. And time was exactly what the daughter appeared to give. But here's where the story twists again. Because buried in the evidence was something the prosecution didn't emphasize. A message draft. Never sent. Found on the daughter's phone. It was written in the early morning hours. Addressed to no one. Just a note. It read like a confession and a plea. I don't know how to fix this. That line echoed through the courtroom. Was it guilt? Or was it the breaking point of someone who had spent a lifetime fixing everything for everyone else? The jury was split emotionally, if not legally. Some saw a woman crushed by circumstance. Others saw a woman who chose loyalty over law. And then came the brother's testimony. Against advice. Against logic. He insisted on speaking. He didn't implicate her directly, but he didn't absolve her either. He spoke about fear, about panic, about calling the one person he trusted to help him think. She always knew what to do, he said. That sentence landed like a hammer. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a character reference. And sometimes those are more damning. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward. Because in that moment, the entire case reframed itself. This wasn't about a single violent act. It was about a family system that trained one person to carry everyone else's weight, until the weight crushed them all. And still, one question hung unanswered. What exactly happened during the window when the daughter left the house before sunrise? Because a witness would soon come forward. A neighbor. Someone who hadn't spoken up earlier because they didn't think it mattered. Someone who saw a figure in the driveway. Someone who noticed something being placed into a car. Something small. Something wrapped. That testimony hadn't been heard yet. But when it was, it would shift everything. What happens after a verdict? When the truth still hasn't finished speaking. Because most people think the story ends when guilt is decided. They're wrong. Sometimes, that's when it gets louder. The courtroom looked different on sentencing day. Not physically, emotionally. The tension had shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. No more speculation. No more debates over what might happen. Now it was about consequence. The daughter entered quietly, flanked by attorneys who no longer whispered strategy. Their job was done. All that remained was mitigation. Explanation. Pleas for mercy dressed up as legal argument. Across the room, the brother sat expressionless. Not defiant. Not remorseful in any visible way. Empty. The parent's absence was louder than any sound in the room. 2 chairs. Unoccupied. Staring back at everyone. Before the judge spoke, victim impact statements were allowed. Friends. Extended family. Former colleagues. They painted portraits of loss. Of betrayal. Of disbelief. One longtime friend of the parents spoke through tears about dinners filled with laughter. About generosity. About how the house had once felt safe. None of this makes sense, she said. But sense wasn't on trial anymore. Then came the moment no one expected. The daughter asked to speak. A hush fell instantly. The judge hesitated, then nodded. She stood slowly. Too slowly. Her hands trembled. Her voice didn't. "I've been quiet," she began, "because I thought silence would protect someone. I was wrong." Every pen stopped moving. This wasn't in the defense's plan. She didn't confess to violence. She didn't accuse anyone. Instead, she spoke about her life, about being the one who fixed things, about being praised for holding the family together, about never being asked if she was okay, because everyone assumed she was. She spoke about fear, about panic, about the moment when instinct took over. "I didn't think about the law," she said. "I thought about family." Some jurors later said that sentence haunted them because it explained everything and excused nothing. The prosecution didn't object. They let her speak. Because in that moment, her words did more for their case than any argument could. She admitted to moving things, to delaying the call, to believing she could control the fallout if she just acted quickly enough. Not out of malice, out of habit. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. And then she said something that fractured the silence. "I thought if I could make it look normal, maybe it would still be normal." That line landed hard, because it captured the entire tragedy. Not denial, not evil, delusion. The judge listened without interruption. When she finished, she sat down heavily, as if every word had weighed something out of her. The defense tried to recover. They argued diminished capacity under extreme stress, a lifetime of conditioning, a moment of psychological collapse. They asked for leniency. They asked for understanding. The prosecution stood and did something unexpected. They acknowledged her pain. They acknowledged her role as a victim of family dynamics. And then they reminded the court of the law. Intent does not require cruelty, the prosecutor said. It requires choice. And choice had been made. The judge adjusted his papers. No drama, no anger, just finality. He spoke about responsibility, about the danger of believing one is above consequence, about how love cannot excuse obstruction. He sentenced the brother first. Life. No ambiguity. Then he turned to the daughter. The room leaned forward. Her fate was not the same, but it was heavy. Years. Significant years. Enough to redefine a life. As the sentence was read, something in her face changed. Not shock. Recognition. As if she'd known all along. She nodded once, and then her body gave out. The collapse wasn't theatrical. It was complete. Her knees folded. Her hands reached for nothing. Her world narrowed to a point and then vanished. People rushed forward. Guards froze, then moved. The judge called for order. Cameras captured everything. That image would become the symbol of the case. Not the brother. Not the verdict. The daughter, unconscious on the courtroom floor. But here's what the cameras didn't capture. What happened next? As medics worked, she came to briefly. And in that brief moment, she whispered something. Only one person heard it clearly. A bailiff. He later told investigators, she said, "I couldn't stop it." Those 4 words sparked a final wave of speculation. What did she mean? The crime? The cover-up? The family dynamic? Or the outcome? The media seized on it instantly. Pundits debated her meaning for weeks. Was it guilt surfacing? Or grief finally unfiltered? Because here's the thing. This story was never just about violence. It was about control. Who had it? Who lost it? Who believed they could maintain it forever? In the days after sentencing, details emerged that reframed everything again. Old emails, old financial documents, patterns of dependence that showed how deeply entwined the family had become. The daughter hadn't just helped once. She had been helping her entire life, covering emotional gaps, bridging conflicts, making things look fine. And that's why her fall felt inevitable. Not because she was evil, but because no one can carry that role forever without breaking. Public opinion shifted again. Some softened, some hardened, but no one forgot. And the brother? He never spoke again. No appeal statement. No final word. Just silence. Which, in this family, had always been the most dangerous thing of all. What if the most damaging secret in this case wasn't buried in the crime scene, but locked away years before anyone thought to look? Because sealed documents have a way of surfacing at the worst possible time. 3 weeks after sentencing, long after the cameras packed up and the public thought the story was over, a court clerk quietly filed a motion that almost no one noticed. Almost. A previously sealed document was being unclassified. No press release. No announcement. Just paperwork. But paperwork is where the truth hides when emotions get too loud. The document wasn't dramatic at first glance. No graphic photos. No shocking confessions. just a collection of evaluations, emails, and professional notes compiled years earlier. What tied them together was timing. They all predated the crime by nearly a decade, and they told a story no one had ever heard. The file began with a psychological assessment requested privately, not by law enforcement, but by the family itself. An internal measure. A preventative step, according to the language used. That alone raised eyebrows. Families confident in their stability don't commission evaluations quietly. The assessment focused on family dynamics, control structures, emotional roles. The conclusions were unsettling. The evaluator described a system built on imbalance. Parents who unconsciously rewarded compliance over autonomy. A daughter placed into an emotional caretaker role far too early. A son marginalized, not through cruelty, but through comparison. One line stood out. This family operates under the assumption that problems can be managed if kept internal. External intervention is viewed as failure. Read that again, because it explains everything. The evaluator warned that crisis response within the family was likely to prioritize containment over resolution. Containment, not healing, not accountability. Containment. The recommendation was clear. Reduce dependency. Encourage boundaries. Allow failures to be public. The family never followed through. Emails included in the file showed polite acknowledgments. Thanks. Appreciation. And then silence. The pattern repeated. Another report years later referenced escalating tension. Increased reliance on the daughter to stabilize conflicts. Heightened emotional volatility in the son. Again, recommendations were made. Again, they were ignored. Why? Because the system was working. Until it wasn't. When journalists finally got hold of the document, reactions were swift. Some called it a blueprint for disaster. Others accused the media of retrofitting meaning where none existed. But experts saw something else. They saw inevitability. Not inevitability of violence. Inevitability of collapse. The daughter's role was spelled out with chilling accuracy. She demonstrates high functionality under pressure, but exhibits delayed emotional processing. Risk of psychological break increases when perceived control is lost. That sentence circulated widely. It reframed her courtroom collapse not as weakness, but as outcome. A delayed reaction finally arriving all at once. The prosecution had never seen this document. Neither had the defense. It had been sealed under confidentiality rules and forgotten. But now it mattered, because it raised an uncomfortable question. If the family knew there were warning signs, if professionals had flagged the risks, if intervention was advised and declined, who really failed here? Public discourse shifted again, not toward absolution, but toward understanding. Some commentators argued the daughter was set up to fail by a system that relied on her until she broke. Others argued that knowing the risks made her choices worse, not better, because awareness brings responsibility. The brothers' history took on new light too. The file described emotional isolation, identity erosion, feelings of being surplus. None of that excused violence, but it explained trajectory. And trajectories matter, because crimes don't emerge from nowhere. They follow lines. The sealed document also revealed something deeply unsettling. There had been a prior incident. Never reported. Never public. A late-night call years earlier. A heated confrontation. A moment when things almost crossed a line. The daughter intervened then too. She de-escalated. Redirected. Smoothed it over. The system reset. Everyone moved on. Except nothing actually changed. Experts weighed in quickly. This is what happens when families mistake control for care, one said. When one member is tasked with stabilizing everyone else, failure becomes catastrophic. The daughter's sentencing now looked different. Not lighter, not heavier, just tragic. Because her actions on that Sunday morning were no longer isolated mistakes. They were consistent behavior in a system that trained her to respond exactly that way. And that's the hardest truth. She didn't become someone else that night. She became exactly who she had always been. The public reaction fractured further. Some saw systemic failure. Some saw personal failure. But one thing was clear. The story wasn't finished. Because once the document was unsealed, attorneys began to move. Civil suits were filed. Not against the daughter. Against the estate. Against advisors. Against institutions that had helped maintain the illusion of stability. Suddenly, the case expanded beyond a courtroom. It became a referendum on power families, on privacy, on the danger of believing fame insulates you from consequence. And then came the final revelation in the document. A handwritten note attached to the last assessment. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't formal. It was personal. If this family ever experiences a sudden loss of control, the evaluator wrote, the response will be extreme. Either total withdrawal or total containment. There is no middle ground. Total containment. That's what the daughter attempted. Not because she was cold, because she was conditioned. When the brothers' legal team reviewed the document, they changed strategy entirely. They stopped arguing innocence. They argued inevitability. That didn't save him, but it changed how history would remember the case. No longer as a sudden explosion, but as a slow burn. The daughter, meanwhile, was transferred to medical supervision following her collapse. Reports said she was lucid but withdrawn. Cooperative. Quiet. When asked if she wanted to comment on the unsealed documents, she declined. One statement was released through her attorney. I did what I thought I had been taught to do. That sentence spread just as fast as her collapse video, because it asked a question no one wanted to answer. Who teaches someone to do the wrong thing and then punishes them when they do it? The case became required reading in legal and psychology courses. Not for the crime, for the system. And still, one final piece remained unexplained. Because buried at the bottom of the unsealed file was a reference to a conversation that never made it into evidence. A conversation between the parents and a third party. Someone outside the family. Someone who warned them explicitly. Someone whose name was redacted. For now, what if the warning everyone ignored didn't come from a stranger, but from someone the family trusted more than anyone else? Because the redacted name at the bottom of that unsealed file wasn't an outsider. It wasn't a government official. It wasn't a clinician paid to analyze from a distance. It was someone who had sat at the same dinner table. Someone who had laughed at the same jokes. Someone who had watched the family dynamic from the inside and felt a chill long before the rest of the world ever would. When journalists finally obtained a less redacted version of the document through a separate civil filing, the name emerged quietly. No fanfare. No press conference. Just a line restored. A longtime family advisor. Not legal. Not medical. Personal. A confidant. The kind of person families lean on when things feel too sensitive to share publicly. And that's what made their warning so disturbing. Years before the crime, this advisor had requested a private meeting with the parents. No assistants. No schedules. Just the four of them in a room with the doors closed. According to notes later summarized in the file, the conversation was uncomfortable almost immediately. The advisor didn't speak in hypotheticals. Didn't sugarcoat. They spoke plainly. They said the family was operating on borrowed stability, that the daughter was being used as a pressure valve, that the son was slipping into a state of resentment that would not self-correct. Most chilling of all, they warned that if a crisis ever occurred, the family would respond by trying to control the narrative instead of addressing the reality. Your instinct will be to protect the image, the advisor said, according to the notes. And that instinct will make everything worse. The parents listened. They nodded. They thanked the advisor. And then they did nothing. Why? Because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. The family hadn't imploded. The brand remained intact. The daughter still handled everything. The son hadn't caused public embarrassment. In their world, silence equaled success. The advisor pushed again months later. Another meeting. Another warning. This time, the tone shifted. Less concern. More urgency. They urged the parents to release control. To let professionals intervene openly. To stop using the daughter as the solution to every problem. They warned explicitly that she would break. That phrase appears verbatim in the notes. She will break. The parents reportedly disagreed. They argued that she was strong, capable, willing. They framed her role as choice, not burden. And maybe that's what she believed too. At least at first. The advisor eventually stepped back. Not out of indifference. Out of exhaustion. Because you can't save people who believe they don't need saving. Years passed. The advisor remained on the periphery. Invited to holidays. Included in milestones. But no longer listened to. Their warnings became background noise. Until Sunday morning. When the news broke, the advisor reportedly knew immediately that the worst-case scenario had arrived. Not because of details. Because of patterns. They contacted investigators voluntarily. Offered context. Provided notes. But much of what they shared wasn't admissible. Not relevant to criminal acts. too psychological, too historical. Still, it mattered, because it explained why no one called for help sooner. Why the instinct was containment, not confession. Why the daughter acted without thinking of law or consequence. She wasn't improvising. She was executing training. Training she never consciously agreed to, but absorbed over decades. Public reaction to the advisor's revelation was mixed. Some accused them of hindsight bias. Others asked why they didn't do more. When asked if they believed the tragedy could have been prevented, the advisor paused, then answered honestly, yes, but not the way people think. They explained that prevention wouldn't have looked dramatic. No dramatic rescues. No ultimatums. It would have looked like discomfort. Public discomfort. Private conflict. Letting things be messy. Things this family avoided at all costs. The daughter's name appeared again in the testimony. She was never meant to carry that role alone, the advisor said. But once she did, no one wanted to take it back. Those words landed harder than any accusation, because they implied abandonment disguised as trust. Meanwhile, the daughter remained under medical supervision. Limited contact. Few statements. But one detail emerged through her legal team. She had requested the unsealed documents. All of them. She read the advisor's warnings. And according to those close to her, she cried for hours. Not because she disagreed. Because she recognized herself. She reportedly said something that never reached the press. I thought being needed meant being loved. That line didn't make headlines. But it explained everything. As Chapter 6 closed, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a story about one terrible night. It was a story about years of quiet decisions. About what happens when families reward silence, punish vulnerability, and mistake control for care. And still, one final question remained. Because if the advisor saw this coming, if professionals documented it, if warning signs were everywhere, why didn't anyone intervene publicly? The answer to that question would lead to the most controversial chapter yet. What if the silence surrounding this family wasn't accidental, but engineered? Because by the time Chapter 6 ended, one uncomfortable truth was staring everyone in the face. This family didn't exist in a vacuum. They existed inside an industry that rewards discretion, protects reputation, and quietly removes problems before they ever become public. And that industry had been doing its job very well. For decades, Hollywood doesn't just create stories. It controls them. It decides which narratives rise, which get buried, and which never see daylight at all. And families like this one don't survive for generations without learning how to play that game. From the outside, the protection looks like loyalty. From the inside, it looks like insurance. Publicists, advisors, fixers who never put their names on anything. When small issues surfaced, they were handled quietly. An argument here, a heated moment there, a concern raised and smoothed over. Nothing illegal, nothing reportable, just enough intervention to keep the image intact. And every time the system worked, confidence grew. Confidence that problems could always be contained. Confidence that consequences could always be delayed. Confidence that silence was safer than exposure. The daughter absorbed this logic early. She watched how stories were shaped, how uncomfortable questions were redirected, how no comment could be more powerful than denial. She learned that calm was currency, that appearances mattered more than process, that asking for help publicly was a failure, not a solution. This wasn't taught in words. It was taught in behavior. The industry culture reinforced it constantly. Colleagues praised the family for being private. Media respected boundaries. Access was granted only to those who didn't pry. The silence became part of the brand. And brands are protected. When early warning signs appeared, they didn't trigger alarms. They triggered strategy. How do we manage this quietly? How do we keep this contained? How do we prevent embarrassment? Those questions replaced the most important one. How do we stop this from getting worse? The advisor from Chapter 6 wasn't the only one who noticed problems. They were just the only one who put it in writing. Others saw things and chose discretion. Because discretion is rewarded. People who speak up lose access, lose trust, lose careers. So instead of intervention, there was accommodation. Schedules were adjusted. Tensions worked around. The daughter leaned on harder. And she didn't protest. Because protest would have disrupted the machine. The machine that fed everyone. The industry has a phrase for this. Handle it internally. It sounds professional, responsible, but it often means something else entirely. Delay, suppress, Control. And when control fails, panic sets in. That's what happened the night everything broke. The daughter didn't just act as a sister. She acted as a trained responder in a system that had taught her exactly how to behave when things went wrong. Stabilize. Contain. Buy time. Time for advisors to step in. Time for narratives to be shaped. Time for damage to be minimized. But the system failed her. Because this wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't something a press release could fix. It was final. And when finality arrives, the industry has no playbook. In the weeks after sentencing, journalists began connecting dots they had previously ignored. Old interviews where questions were deflected. Moments when uncomfortable topics were laughed off. Stories that never made print because editors were advised to wait. None of it was illegal, but all of it was influential. The family hadn't just been protected by love. They had been protected by culture. A culture that values success over transparency. A culture that equates vulnerability with weakness. A culture that quietly sidelines people who threaten the illusion. And the daughter had been shaped inside that culture from childhood. She didn't know another way. So when chaos erupted, she didn't reach outward. She reached inward. To habits. To roles. To instincts reinforced 1,000 times before. That's why her actions felt deliberate and desperate at the same time. Because they were learned responses, not calculated crimes. The public reaction to this revelation was explosive. Some turned their anger toward the industry itself. How many other families are being protected right now? How many warning signs are being ignored? How many daughters are being turned into shields? Others pushed back hard. They accused critics of shifting blame, of absolving individuals of responsibility. And that tension became the heart of the debate. Responsibility versus context. Choice versus conditioning. The industry responded the only way it knows how. Silence. No statements. No reforms. No acknowledgement. Because acknowledging the problem would mean admitting complicity. And complicity is expensive. Behind closed doors, however, things shifted. Studios revised internal protocols. Advisors changed language. Risk management teams became more aggressive. Not in preventing harm. In preventing exposure. Because that's what the system does best. The daughter became a cautionary tale whispered in private meetings. Not publicly discussed. Not defended. Just quietly referenced. She handled too much. They let it go too far. It can't happen again. But no one asked the most important question. Why does it keep happening at all? Meanwhile, the daughter's health deteriorated. Medical reports described emotional withdrawal, severe guilt, a sense of identity collapse. When someone's entire self-worth is built on being needed. What happens when that role destroys everything? She wasn't just grieving her parents. She was grieving the version of herself she believed in. The fixer, the protector, the one who made things okay. That identity was gone. And without it, she had nothing to stand on. In one rare conversation with a counselor, she reportedly said something chilling. If I hadn't done anything, they would have hated me for not trying. That sentence reveals the trap perfectly. Do something and be punished. Do nothing and be condemned. That's the impossible space she lived in. And that's the space the industry helped create. As Chapter 7 closes, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a systemic failure. A failure of culture. A failure of intervention. A failure to value truth over image. And now, the silence that once protected the family was turning against the system itself. Because lawmakers were watching. Advocacy groups were mobilizing. And the question was no longer about one case. It was about how many more were waiting. What happens when the noise finally stops? And there's nothing left to hide behind? Because after the verdicts, the debates, the documentaries in progress, and the endless online arguments, something unexpected happened. The world moved on. Not all at once. Not cleanly, but steadily. Headlines shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. The algorithms found fresher outrage. And in the quiet left behind, the daughter was forced to confront a reality she had never prepared for. A life without an audience. A life without a role. For the first time, no one needed her to fix anything. The medical wing where she was transferred after her courtroom collapse was silent in a way she had never experienced. No phones ringing. No schedules to manage. No crises waiting on her response. Just hours. Long, unstructured hours. At first, she tried to recreate control in small ways. Organizing her meals. straightening items that didn't need straightening, asking for updates she didn't actually want. But control, once stripped of purpose, feels hollow. And slowly, the behaviors that once made her indispensable began to fall apart. Doctors noted dissociation, emotional flattening, periods of intense guilt followed by numbness. When asked how she felt, she struggled to answer. Not because she didn't feel anything, because she felt everything and nothing at the same time. One therapist asked her a simple question: "Who are you when no one needs you?" She didn't respond. Not because she didn't understand the question, because she had never been allowed to answer it. Her identity had always been external. Daughter, mediator, protector, fixer. Without those labels, she felt undefined. And undefined scared her more than prison ever could. The facility encouraged her to write. Not for publication, not for statements, just for herself. At first, she resisted. Writing felt like exposure. Exposure felt dangerous. But eventually, she began. What emerged wasn't a confession. It was a map. She wrote about moments she'd forgotten she remembered. Being praised for being the strong one. Being thanked for stepping in. Being overlooked when she struggled because she could handle it. She wrote about resentment she never allowed herself to feel. About how much anger it took to remain calm all the time. About the fear that if she stopped helping, she would be discarded. One line appeared repeatedly: "If I don't do it, everything falls apart." That belief had guided her entire life. And now, everything had fallen apart anyway. That realization shattered something fundamental, because it meant the role she had sacrificed herself for never guaranteed safety in the first place. Outside the facility, reactions to her condition were mixed. Some commentators mocked it, called it manipulation, called it performance. Others recognized it immediately. People who had lived similar lives saw themselves in her withdrawal. They didn't excuse her actions, but they understood her collapse. Letters continued to arrive. Not hate mail. Confessions. Parents. Siblings. Partners. People who wrote about carrying families on their backs. About being punished when they finally failed. The daughter read some of them. Not all. Some were too close to home. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened on the legal front. Her attorneys advised her to stay silent, to avoid statements, to focus on recovery. But she made a request that stunned them. She wanted to speak. Not to the press. Not to the court. To no one in particular. She wanted her words recorded. Not as defense. Not as apology. As testimony. The facility pushed back. The lawyers hesitated. They worried about optics. About misinterpretation. About consequences. She listened. Then said something quietly that ended the discussion. "I've already lost everything that mattered to me. I don't want to lose the truth too." Arrangements were made. A controlled setting. No cameras. No live audience. Just her, a recorder, and a professional present. What she said there would not be released immediately, but excerpts would later surface. And when they did, they changed how the public saw her. She didn't deny her actions. She described them. Not dramatically. Not defensively. Clinically. She explained the moment she realized what had happened. The panic. The instinct. The belief that she could still make it manageable if she acted quickly enough. She admitted to moving things. To delaying. To choosing containment over clarity. She didn't blame her brother. She didn't blame her parents. She blamed a belief system. "I thought chaos was my fault," she said. "I thought order was my responsibility." That sentence rippled outward, because it named something many people had never articulated. She spoke about fear of exposure. Not to the public. To herself. What if I wasn't strong? What if I wasn't needed? What if I was just ordinary? Those questions haunted her more than prison bars ever would. When asked if she regretted her actions, she paused for a long time, then answered carefully, "I regret believing I could control something that was never mine to control." That distinction mattered. She wasn't minimizing harm. She was redefining responsibility. The recording ended with a moment no one expected. She addressed no one. Not the victims. Not the court. Not the audience she knew would eventually hear her words. She addressed herself. "I don't know who I am yet," she said, "but I know who I can't be anymore." That recording remained sealed for weeks. But when portions leaked, reaction was immediate. Some called it self-serving. Others called it overdue honesty. But the most powerful responses came quietly. Therapists, social workers, family counselors. They shared the clip internally, not as a crime story, as a cautionary one. Meanwhile, the brother remained silent. No statements. No recorded testimony. Just appeals filed through attorneys. His silence contrasted sharply with hers. And that contrast reshaped the narrative again. Not in terms of guilt. In terms of growth. The daughter wasn't seeking absolution. She was seeking separation. Separation from the role that had consumed her. Separation from the belief that love required sacrifice without limit. And then, something else happened. She declined a privilege, a reduction, a transfer, an accommodation offered quietly due to her condition. She refused it, not out of defiance, out of clarity. I don't want special treatment, she said. I want accountability without illusion. That decision stunned even her critics, because it broke the pattern. For the first time, she wasn't trying to manage outcomes. She was accepting them. Public reaction softened, not universally, but perceptibly. The story shifted from spectacle to reflection, and reflection is harder to dismiss. As Chapter 8 draws to a close, the question isn't whether she deserves sympathy. That debate will never end. The real question is this: what happens when someone raised to hold everything together finally lets go? Because letting go doesn't erase damage, but it might prevent it from spreading. And in that quiet facility, stripped of roles, stripped of control, stripped of illusion, the daughter began the most unfamiliar task of her life: living without fixing. What if the most lasting consequence of this tragedy wasn't prison time, but a reckoning no one could control? Because while the daughter was learning how to exist without fixing, something else was happening far beyond the walls of her facility. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. People were talking, not about the crime, about the system. And once that conversation started, it didn't stay contained. It never does. It began in professional circles: family therapists, trauma specialists, legal scholars who had followed the case closely but spoken carefully while it was active. Now, they spoke freely. They talked about enmeshment, about invisible labor, about how certain family roles are rewarded until they become cages. They used the case not as spectacle, but as case study. And then something unexpected happened. The conversation leaked into workplaces, into households, into group chats where people began asking questions they'd never asked out loud before. Why am I always the one who smooths things over? Why does responsibility default to me? What happens if I stop? Those questions didn't come from criminals. They came from teachers, caregivers, oldest siblings, high-functioning adults praised for their resilience. People who had never seen themselves as vulnerable. Until now, advocacy groups noticed the shift. They weren't focused on celebrity. They were focused on pattern. They saw how the daughter's role mirrored millions of others, minus the spotlight, minus the tragedy. And they saw opportunity, not political opportunity, preventive opportunity. A coalition formed quietly, not flashy, not radical. Professionals from mental health, education, and social services came together around one central idea. Invisible roles cause visible harm. They called it the Load Project. The goal wasn't to assign blame. It was to name dynamics people had lived inside for years without language. Caretaker fatigue, role entrapment, responsibility displacement, concepts that existed academically but rarely reached the public. Until now, the case had given them a narrative people couldn't ignore. They didn't center the daughter. They centered the pattern. Panels were held. White papers released. Seminars hosted for educators and counselors. They asked one foundational question: who is carrying too much, and why don't we see it until it breaks? The legal world responded too. Family court judges began referencing the case in training sessions. Not the crime, the context. They discussed how family systems influence behavior, how mitigation arguments often fail to address root cause, how prevention requires earlier recognition. Even law enforcement quietly reviewed protocols. Not about containment, about intervention. How many calls had been brushed aside because nothing technically illegal had occurred? How many warning signs were dismissed because the family looked functional? The answer was uncomfortable. Meanwhile, journalists who had once chased the collapse clip began digging deeper. Not into the family, into similar cases. Patterns emerged. Stories that never made headlines because no one died. Families where one member absorbed conflict until burnout led to addiction, disappearance, or breakdown. People labeled unreliable when they finally cracked. The daughter's recorded testimony resurfaced again and again. One line became a refrain: I thought chaos was my fault. That sentence resonated far beyond the case. It appeared in articles, in op-eds, in therapist offices scribbled onto whiteboards, because it named a belief many people lived by without realizing it. And beliefs shape behavior. The Load project gained traction faster than anyone expected. Schools requested resources. Corporations invited consultants. Family counseling centers adapted frameworks. Not because of celebrity, because of recognition.